2-minute warning. It is good to see everyone here this morning. If you are visiting with us, you are our honored guest, and we are certainly glad that you are here. If you're visiting, then we ask that you give us time to introduce ourselves and get to know you better. And for those of you who are not visiting, make sure you take the time and get to know our visitors better. It's a good opportunity to encourage one another, and that is certainly one of the earthly blessings that we have as Christians. We have been talking about finding true happiness. I have said before, and will continue to say, that is a challenging topic to cover, but we are using the spiritual sword from January. The theme was, Have You Found True Happiness? We do have some extra copies. If you need one, one will be provided to you. Generally speaking, we're using this as our guide. I will tell you, I don't follow it verbatim. Sometimes the class will look more like the lessons in the book than others, but this is our guide. We have been talking, like I said, about finding happiness. We started with the article about happiness not by riches. Then we went on and finished up, for the most part, last week, not by human wisdom, which is on page 8. And this morning we're going to start diving into not by pleasure, that begins on page 12. I'm simply referencing this so that you will be encouraged to read these articles. A lot of what we cover will match up. We'll cover some things that aren't there, and these authors will cover some information that we won't necessarily talk about in class. So just wanted to make sure that we point out what the text is and get started talking this morning about not by pleasure. One of the things I wanted to do as a bit of a leftover and housekeeping from last time, we were talking about how riches can be deceitful. And getting into the conversation about deceitful, I pointed out that it has been said that if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes truth to the world. And Beth had pointed out that that came from Himmler, who was Adolf Hitler's chief of propaganda. I wasn't sure that she was right. She was right. So I wanted to point that out and emphasize an aspect of that. We talk about deceit. We have encountered, unfortunately, people in our lives who are deceitful. And a lot of the times in the worldly setting, we find that some of the biggest problems are from those methods, manners, and incidences of deceit. There are people today that will deny the Holocaust ever existed. And in part because those that perpetrated it were so good at lying and convincing people of the soundness of their lies. So, as we talk about where happiness is not found, we will continue to talk about deceitfulness. Because so many times the world is going to deceive us into thinking things that are counter to the Word of God. So we have to be very careful in watching for and discerning that deceit. So I wanted to point that out. Beth was right, I was wrong, and we've got to be careful of those that would deceive us. That factors into happiness in every way that we're going to talk about. So this morning we are diving into Not by Pleasure. And the article that we're using is by Jason Jackson. Jason talks about a particular individual that he knew named Ray. Ray had found a congregation, had become a Christian out of a life of addiction and sinful pleasures. I point this out for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's important to understand what Ray went through. But it's also important to understand that sinful pleasures do not have to take on the magnitude that Ray had in his life. Ray had problems with alcohol. Ray had problems with drugs. Ray had problems with addictions to inappropriate relationships. And it talks about how all of that snowballed and basically became not only his spiritual destruction, but his earthly destruction as well. Now, that is a powerful, painful, poignant lesson for us. Here's the other lesson. We don't have to go that far to be as wrong as Ray. When we talk about the things that do not produce happiness, quite often we're talking about sinful lifestyles. We're talking about sinful pursuits. And I think sometimes we get a little caught up in the magnitude of the sin. Brethren, sin is sin. It can be what we think of as the big ones, or it can be, oh, that little white lie that I felt okay getting away with. Both are sins. So when we talk about these things, I don't want us to get into a situation where we say, okay, yep, Ray was horrible. Ray was an alcoholic, he was a drug addict, on and on and on and on. I'm not like Ray. Ray was a sinner. We are sinners. So our pursuit is to not let that sin consume us. We will not be perfect in the sense of without sin, but we work to perfect ourselves, which is the maturing process. When we fall down, we get back up, and we get back on the right trail. So when we look at Ray in this context, in this article, don't say to yourself, well, I'm not like Ray. Okay, have you overeaten a couple of times in the last week? Have you gone after pursuits that are more earthly than they are spiritual? If so, then you're like Ray in a sense, in the sense that we have to be careful of. Okay? So, the other aspect of the example of Ray is something that hits a little closer to home. When we pursue happiness through pleasure, excuse me, we find that a little bit of enjoyment only goes so far. And then we need a little bit more enjoyment and a little bit more enjoyment in order to come back to that level of happiness. And when I say happiness, remember, we've talked about the definition. Earthly happiness. Earthly happiness is, and we said it last week, and I think we said it before, temporary. It won't last a long time before we need to do whatever it is again to get that level of happiness. Now, anyone who has ever studied addictions will say that physiologically the body will behave that way with things like alcohol, drugs, whatever. Those things that produce the high, and I don't necessarily mean an illicit high, but just the elevated emotional state. To get that point over and over and over again, we have to go further and further and further. Okay, if you've ever known anyone that struggled with alcohol or drugs, they will tell you, it started out one drink. Okay, but to get the same effect, next time I had to have 2 drinks, and so forth and so on. Now, we talk about it in the sense of truly illicit behaviors. Again, remember, sin is sin. It can be a matter of television. Ever sit down legitimately and say, I've just got to get my mind off of all of this. Not watching anything bad on television, just watching. Then 4 or 5 hours later, you think, where did my Saturday go? So that first opportunity to sit and watch and just kind of decompress wasn't necessarily a bad thing until you realize what you had done with all of the rest of the time between when you made that first decision and then you binge watched some series throughout the whole day. Does that make sense? Because we're talking about pleasure, and we're talking about it in an earthly sense. You know, Bob said he covered Ecclesiastes fairly well in the first class. So I've been trying not to get deep into Ecclesiastes. So let's talk a little bit about a conclusion that Solomon made. He reached in what he wrote the realization that for all of life's pleasures, for all of the enjoyment that we can have in this world, and, okay, question. Is it wrong to find pleasure in this world? No. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. But I wanted to clarify that point way up front. So Solomon concluded that for all of life's pleasures, for all of the things that we can enjoy here, the human soul craves something more. It wants more than what we can find here. His conclusion was that man craves things that aren't available in the earthly pursuit. And overall, throughout the rest of the weeks of this class, that's what we're going to talk about. If you've got your Bibles, turn to Ephesians 4 and verse 14. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14. That we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. Earthly pleasure, even earthly happiness is deceitful. Why? You know, one of the first answers last time, and it was right on, well, it's temporary. And we've talked about that already a little bit this morning. It is temporary. It lasts only a short period of time. Everybody looks forward to vacation until the last day of vacation. And then you realize, okay, I've got to go back to reality tomorrow. Things will reset. So earthly pleasure is temporary. And like the man in the story, Ray, it takes more of that pleasure to get the same level of enjoyment out of things. So one year we go for a week of vacation, we get to the end of the week, and it's like, oh, I got to go back to work on Monday. And then the next time we think, hey, I wonder if we could take a week and a half. Is there a way I could take Thursday and then we'll leave on Friday rather than leaving on Saturday? Well, what if we then, took Monday and Tuesday off and didn't see the point I'm making? It's no longer enough just to have a week of vacation. We've got to have more because we're seeking that same enjoyment, and it takes more to get there. Moments of pleasure make us crave more of that pleasure. The other aspect of seeking happiness through earthly pleasures is the fact that a lot of earthly pleasures become intertwined with sinful desires. Now, I'm talking about extremes, but I think in talking about extremes, we can look and see how those things apply to the life that we have here. Alcohol leads to a desire for more alcohol, and the effect of alcohol leads to other things, like promiscuity, like impaired decision making, and impaired on multiple levels. I can be so intoxicated that I think, okay, it's okay for me to get in the car. Okay, that's mistake number one. Mistake number two is actually driving, because then physically I'm making mistakes. So it expands over time. And then more alcohol leads to, okay, I'm consuming more than I ever have before, and I'm just not getting out of it what I want, what I need, what my body now physically craves, and then it escalates to a drug level. and that escalates. And eventually this becomes an addiction. So it starts out as a decision. And follow my path. This is a place we've got to carefully tread. It starts out as a choice. I decide to take that first drink, that first pill, that first whatever. It becomes a situation where my body starts to take away that choice from me. That doesn't excuse me for the bad choice. The first one, the one after that, the one after that. It does not excuse it, but it takes more and more and more control away from me. Because my body says, okay, in order to function now, physically, here's what you're going to have to do. And that becomes incredibly hard to break. Now, the reason I am stressing this is because this is an extreme example of what we can do with everyday common things that otherwise don't seem to be sinful. I use television because that's a personal challenge. You know what? You get through the week, you think, okay, Friday, I'm just going to sit down, I'm going to relax with something for an hour, then I'm going to, go upstairs and study or read or whatever. It never happens that way. Because I enjoy that hour. Okay, I just one more. Netflix is going to move it on automatically if I don't stop things. So, we talk about drugs and alcohol in the extreme, but we've got to understand that those pleasures aren't always those horrible illicit things that we see in the newspaper and think, oh, I'd never be involved with that. It's a matter of, as we seek earthly pleasures, our psyche, the way we think, the way we're made, our bodies will say, okay, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And again, that is not an excuse, because we've got the ability to make the choice from the beginning not to go that far. Does that make sense?
Talking about the alcohol, from a family member who was an alcoholic, I asked him one time, you must really love the alcohol. He said, no, I hate alcohol. What he at one time had loved, he now hates it. He can no longer control it.
Perfect segue into our next point. Ultimately, we will grow so immune to the pleasure that one of two things happens. One, we're hopelessly addicted. And I mean hopelessly. It is possible, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's likely to become so addicted that without outside intervention, often medical, you physically, from your body's standpoint, you cannot stop. I think as Christians we need to understand that. Because if we've not struggled with a particular problem, it's easy to say, well, why don't you just snap out of it? Why don't you just decide not to do that? Okay? Ever had a headache so bad that you cannot even open your eyes? Imagine that as the normal course of life. That's what addictions will do to you. Now, we're talking in this case about a chemical addiction. There are other addictions as well. There are psychological addictions. But we need to understand exactly what Tim said. The alcoholic gets to the point where they no longer enjoy the alcohol. It's not about the alcohol anymore. They're hopelessly addicted. The other situation, especially if we don't let it get to the point of addiction, if we don't curb it and make different decisions, we reach a point of despair. We know that we've wasted our time for no good. We know that we don't get the pleasure out of that we used to get or we initially got. And we reach the point and think, well, what's the point? That's where the Christian life matters so much. Because, brethren, if we have that focus, if we have the ability, and the ability often involves others, to remind ourselves that all of this is temporary, and that a perfect home awaits us, then it's a little easier to say, well, I can be happy here, waiting and working toward heaven. Does that make sense? Now, I mentioned something just a moment ago. We can get into a state of despair. Excuse me. We can realize, I've wasted my life, I've wasted my day, I've wasted this hour, I've wasted whatever it is. And then the point of decision, the point of pivot says, do I wallow in that despair or do I get out of it? And sometimes getting out of it is a well-timed text from a brother or sister, is a well-timed phone call, is a well-timed card, is a well-timed recognition that we receive from someone else that sees value in us. I may not know you, but I better, as a Christian, know the value that God has assigned to your soul. Because then we understand these earthly pleasures are a distraction toward ultimately what God has promised, in part because of the value He sees in us. Does that make sense? Okay. So, the other aspect of all of this earthly pleasure thing is, have earthly pleasures taken beyond acceptable levels ever solved a problem for you? Now, let me give you an example. If I sit down, watch one episode of something that just completely takes me out of the challenges, the difficulties, the problem that's set before me that I don't know how to address, and then after that one episode come back, engage, and my mind is clearer to focus on that, any problem in that? Now, hopefully, we will mature to the point that the distraction we need is more a matter of, okay, I'm going to quit worrying about the bills and I'm going to do a little Bible study. Or I'm going to take time and pray. You know, a lot of the big self-help, creativity boosting, the common things that we will hear from the world about bettering ourselves involves a word, meditation. Okay? My challenge to you this week is, if you read any article that suggests meditation, I want you to take out the word meditation and put prayer in place there. Because, you know, we read from the Bible that even if we don't know what to pray, it's an opportunity for us to ask for help to the God that loves us. So rather than me watching that episode when I get home, maybe 15 minutes, and even if it is a matter of saying, Lord, I don't even know what to ask you for. I don't even know how to ask it. But 15 minutes talking to the one person that always hears, and I use person loosely, the God that always hears, the God that always cares, and the God that always answers. May not be, you know, the answer handed to us on a plate that says, okay, here's what you need to do. In all likelihood, it's not going to be that. But an opportunity to say, God, I need help. Or, I simply need to refocus on what's important. You know, some days, on Sunday mornings, I try to get up, study a little bit, do a couple of things in preparation, thinking about it from the standpoint of, okay, a new week, I want to start it off right. And all of these worldly things start creeping back in. Oh yeah, I got to remember to make that phone call tomorrow. Oh yeah, you know, Tuesday afternoon I've got this, I got to make sure. And then I have to say, stop. And pull back, pray, and move on. Now, the question is, what does this have to do with earthly pleasure and finding happiness? It's a question, not necessarily rhetorical.
One
Jay?
thing you just mentioned is Linda and I work really hard at being present.
Yes.
Be in the moment where you are with whom you are. Don't live in the past, or living in the future like we just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time our brains are in the past or the future.
Yes.
We are not in the present.
Right.
And God says, that's all you got.
Yes.
That's where you need to be.
Yes,
And when you learn to do that, and that is challenging, let me tell you,
it is.
to retrain your mind, to not be in the past or the future, but to be in the moment.
Yes.
In the present.
Do you hear what Jay said? Be in this moment. Because we can't change the past. The future is not promised and not here yet. So the only thing in which we can actively engage, truthfully, is the present. He makes another good example. He said, Linda and I. Okay? Husbands and wives. Or those of you working toward being husbands and wives. And I'm going to pick on the gentleman. Ever been sitting, looking at your wife, she's telling you something, she gets to the end of it, she's asking you a question, and you think, what did she just say?
No.
Tim says no. So it is a matter of being engaged in the present. Now, if you're anything like me, your mind easily and quickly wanders off to something else. It is a matter of choice and discipline to not allow that to continually happen. And to the point that sometimes if you know that is happening, say to your husband or wife, your boyfriend or your girlfriend, I just can't focus on this right now. And you know, especially with my wife, if I say that, one of two things happens. Most often the answer or the response is, how can I help? That's a powerful response, folks. Because she said a number of things. Number one, she cares. Number two, she understands. Number three, whatever she can do, she is willing to do. Even if I say, I just need to be left alone. So that is very important. The present is what we have. And, you know, I think about the present, especially in the context of where we are right now. Now is the time to tell someone that they are important to us, that we are glad they are here, because we don't know what difference we can make in someone's life by saying that. And if we're serious about pleasure, and I mean pleasure in a godly sense, what is more pleasurable than seeing the ability that you have to put a smile on someone else's face? Even if it takes weeks to get to that smile. Ever told someone that you're glad they're here and then realized that they were on the verge of tears? And it takes days or weeks to engage to the level that you can actually make a difference. I will tell you, in life, toward a heavenly pursuit, there's really nothing more pleasurable than being able to be a difference in someone's life for good. As Christians, it's a responsibility, but it's an opportunity. There was a researcher, and I suspect there are plenty of you that know more about this particular person and his work. His name was Maslow. And he talked about a hierarchy of needs. We cannot talk to someone about the promises that God has offered, the sacrifice of His Son, and the hope we have in that if they are so hungry. And I don't mean, okay, Martin's stomach's growling because he hadn't eaten in the last 3 hours. But they are so hungry because they haven't had meals in a row. How do we expect them to listen to something that is spiritual when the physical is so much of a challenge? We need to understand that, yes, the Word of God, the gospel message, is the most important message that someone will ever hear. Let's make sure that before we dive into that, they are in a position where they can hear it, not just be talked at. So, back to the question. What does this have to do with happiness? Well, there's an aspect of being present. I appreciate that very much, because when we are present, when we understand that this moment is really all that I am promised, then we think, hopefully, we grow to the point that we think, I better make the very best of this 60 seconds that I possibly could. Not a matter of, okay, in, let's see, about 2 hours or so, depending on how much Michael wants to talk, I get to sit down and have that meal that I've been thinking about since I got up this morning. Because we may not get there. And once that meal is over, about 3:30 in the afternoon, you're going to be thinking, okay, what's my next meal? See the point? When we're talking about pleasure, we've got to understand the difference between the pleasure that the earth offers us, temporary, fleeting, deceptive, and the pleasure that we will have in heaven. Questions or comments? Yes, sir.
One of the strongest addictions that this writer introduced is, especially when college students know, is pornography.
Yes.
And it is just as easy, from what I've read, to get away from it as it is a drug addiction.
Absolutely. Yes.
But it's just terrible addiction.
Bob talked about the addiction of pornography. Very real. And really, if we think about our own personalities, there are things that we all gravitate toward more likely than other things. I think I've alluded to a good friend of mine, Daniel. Daniel passed away within the last 12 months. And Daniel was a strong example. And Daniel would say, you know what? Satan's not going to tempt Daniel with alcohol. I have no problem. I don't drink. I've never had a drink, not going to drink. But that fast car or that fast motorcycle going by is going to turn my head every time. Now, he fought that, sometimes more successfully than others. After his funeral, his wife told me about a few of the tickets that Daniel had gotten on a motorcycle. But we all have things that are of more temptation than others. I like to escape in a good movie. I like a good meal. Okay? I have to be careful because enough good meals, in my terms, will change what I have to wear, but also affects my physical well-being. I would much prefer, a nice slice of cake or pie than, a legitimate meal. I only eat a meal so I can have dessert, and the doctor says, okay, next time we're going to talk about your blood sugar a little more. So there are all manners of temptation. Bob's point is very well appreciated, but don't think just because alcohol or drugs or pornography or fast cars don't impact you, don't think that something can't. Because we find things in this world that we enjoy, but then we want to enjoy more and more and more. Folks, that's the description of addiction. JJ?
Spending money is something. I mean, it could be just on a simple little thing, but the continuation of that is a high.
Yes. Ever heard the term retail therapy? There are a lot of businesses that are very thankful for the marketing person that came up with the term retail therapy. Okay, I've had a tough day, so I'm going to go buy a new wallet or a new hard drive or a new whatever. Excellent point. The spending of money. And it may not even be the spending of that money as much as it is the acquisition of whatever we spend the money on, because it brings us temporary pleasure.
When I think of things like addiction and things along those lines, I always think of scratching an itch.
Yes.
You scratch an itch, it just gets itchier, and it often causes harm.
Yes. Poison ivy is a great example. As a kid, if I saw poison ivy, I was covered in it. And then we moved to Illinois, and I discovered a thing called poison sumac, which is like the hyperactive cousin of poison ivy. And twice it nearly put me in the hospital. But Patrick's point is well taken. You get a little patch and you start scratching it. And I don't know the whole physiology, but if you scratch it at the right time, you're going to spread it all up your arm. So scratching that itch makes the itch worse, where a little bit of the right cream, ointment, treatment, whatever, would resolve the problem. Make sense? Tim?
You can make an addiction out of anything.
Yes.
A credit card is a very useful tool, and it's great to have,
Yes.
but if you abuse it,
It'll burn you. Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're talking to the point that we now realize that earthly pleasures aren't going to solve the challenges set before us. They only, in many cases, delay us facing whatever the challenge is. They can rob us of the time to be present because we, fixate on things, or we've become addicted and now some of the choice is physically taken away from us. But the understanding that earthly pleasures don't solve problems is something that we've got to not only understand, but really appreciate. Because, it becomes justification when our recreation goes beyond a little bit of a distraction and comes into the realm of avoiding things. You realize that those addictions, those things that we enjoy so much, can be our path toward escaping from the things that we don't have the maturity or the desire to address? Oh, yeah, I'm just going to watch one episode because I don't want to deal with what my child just said or did. I'm going to watch one episode because, there's so many bills on the table, it's going to take me forever to get through them. So we use the earthly pleasures as a distraction. They become an avoidance. So Solomon suggested that the human nature craves meaning and purpose. I think the author said meaning, purpose, and answers. Do earthly pleasures provide any of that? Think carefully before you answer. The human nature, I would argue the way that God designed us, craves meaning, purpose, and answers. Does what we find on earth offer what the soul needs?
Well, it can if you don't let it become an addiction.
Okay.
Well, the author made a good point here, which he said the devil was just as happy when you miss a Sunday morning to go to a lake. You should have said golf. And it is with you being addicted to a drug.
Yes. Yes. The devil doesn't need us in the majors. He just needs us out of the important part. He just needs us to say, well, it's okay to skip once. It's okay not to call him back. It's okay not whatever. Doesn't need us to go all the way, dive headfirst in. Just needs us distracted enough that we will write off matters of faith and importance in God's eyes.
I find that the more worldly the thoughts come, the easier it is for me then to go to my Christian brothers and sisters and talk and get back on. We can help each other. We can make this happen because that's what we need sometimes. Now you know that, sweetheart. Let's not do it that way.
Right.
Because we have each other, and it's powerful. It's extremely powerful.
Yes. Give you an example, and it's an example I was going to get to. I think it's especially relevant with Karen's comment. Wednesday nights here are reviving because midweek we're up to our necks in the world of the week. For those who are working, you've been at work a couple of days, probably 3 days by that point. You have dealt with 3 days of the world coming at you in various ways. And then you've got the opportunity to sit here and hear a lesson, which is good. We got the opportunity to hear prayers. We've got the opportunity to sing together. We hear something designed to focus our minds on some aspect of the Christian life. But I would also argue, after that last amen is some of the most important time for a Christian. The opportunity to stand here sometimes until people start turning off the lights, talking to each other, knowing that this person I am talking to has a like common faith, has to deal with what the world is throwing, has heard the news that they are trying to feed us, but also knows that Jesus Christ is our hope and our salvation, and realizes if God put that much value in someone, I better value them too. The opportunity to be here with each other is so powerful. I fear sometimes when the lake or the golf course draws us away. No, I fear all the time that if we allow that, we are passing on the greatest pleasure that we can have. And I would argue that being encouraged here is an earthly pleasure with spiritual applications. Because we have the opportunity to say, so how are you? And mean it. You know the difference? You know, the difference between I'm headed toward that door, somebody else is headed to that door, and we say, hey, how are you? Versus, Laura, how are you? See the difference? We better. We better, because in the moment, this is the time, this is the place, brethren, we are the people to do that with first. Because Wednesday strengthens me, Sunday strengthens me, so that when I am out in the world and someone that I've never met before clearly is having some sort of difficulty, that we've got the strength, the knowledge, the presence of mind right now to say, hey, I know I don't know you, and I'm not trying to get myself involved where you don't want me involved, but what's going on? Is there something I can help you with? Because pleasure, brethren, is not found in the magazines. It is not found in an ongoing sense in any chemical substance that exists on this earth. It is not found in relationships with people who do not have a like common faith and have no intention of ever having that like common faith. Happiness is found in the realization that heaven is my goal, because heaven will be my home, and along the path, here is a place, here are people, here are classes, here are lessons, here are songs, here are prayers that will help me, that will restore me along that path, and give me the strength to get through the challenges and the temptations that we will deal with as long as we're allowed to live. Yes?
I saw a bumper sticker about a year ago. It said 7 days without Christ makes you wonder.
Yes.
And week was spelled W-E-A-K.
Absolutely.
And what you're saying tonight just made me think of that, or this morning made me think of that, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yes. Yes. Because, it's easy to let ourselves say, well, you know what? It's a beautiful day. It's going to be hot. Folks, it's South Carolina. It's summer. It's going to be hot. But we could say, okay, at the lake today would be great. But if we wait till after lunch, by the time we get there, well, let's just go this morning. And that happens one time. But you're absolutely right. Collectively speaking, if we're not engaged in each other's lives, we've got 2 opportunities to be here a week. Basically, round numbers, 3 hours a week. Those who work at least 40 hours a week. See the ratio issue? You're absolutely right. If we skip once, if we skip twice, Sunday and Wednesday, then we do have a very weak W-E-A-K week. W-E-E-K. Good point. Because we can pursue pleasure to our own demise. And that's the point of that bumper sticker. Pursuing pleasure to our own demise. Yeah, our body and mind may be happy for a temporary time. And you know, where we find the pleasure is very deceptive. Okay, little personal story. Career has always been important to Martin. Not overly to the point of neglecting my family, but when my children were very, very young, there was an 18-month period I spent at least 1 week out of the country every month. And when I wasn't out of the country, I was traveling other places. Career was very important. Not that I wanted a lot of money, that wasn't my pursuit. Not that I was looking for fame and fortune. To me, it was important to contribute, both professionally and to my family. I saw contribution as financial. And again, not to the point of wealth and riches, but a nice house, you know, clothes, etc. Okay, fast forward, 2019, COVID completely annihilated an industry called trade shows. Okay? Can't get together if you can't be together. Trade shows went away. Martin's job went away. Where was my happiness? Where was my pleasure? Sometimes the lesson to us is, hey, you were focused in the wrong place. So we'll leave it there this time. I appreciate the comments and your attention. We'll pick up and finish Not by Pleasure next week.